Am I
Yes,
audible?
yes, yeah.
Okay, sorry, there was a error message. So these flares are thought to be originating from two very specific processes. The first one is thought to be originating from crust cracking, which basically deals with the idea that inside the magnetar there are strong magnetic fields, and due to any instabilities developed inside the crust, stress gets developed to very strong high strengths, and due to this high stress developed inside, the star's crust gets fractured, releasing huge amount of energy. When this energy is getting released, it basically forms a fireball, which is a plasma containing highly energetic charge pairs, and that is released in the magnetosphere, which is basically observed as the flares. The other scenario can be the reconnection scenario. We have a very strong magnetic field around this magnetar, and due to the effects of electron magnetohydrodynamic currents, this magnetic lines of force can get twisted, and as they get twisted, they can result in reconnection, releasing again a large amount of energy in the forms of flares. And in the process, it is thought that it forms a fireball, which is shown here in a cartoon picture, which contains highly energetic electron-positron pairs, and that radiates over the duration over which we observe the flares. So this is the idea. But even within this flares, magnetars show three broad classes of magnetar flares. One is short, intermediate, and giant flares. And I will give an example of each of these classes and explain what I mean by them. So first, the giant flares. And these are the most energetic events that are observed from such magnetars. Their total energies can go up to 10 to the power 44 to 10 to the power 46 ergs, which making them one of the most luminous processes in gamma rays. They can last for a few hundreds of seconds. They are typically characterized by a Hertz spike followed by a very long lasting, slowly decaying tip, in which very clear pulsations are often observed, which corresponds to the spin period of the magnetar. Uh, the peak luminosities can go up to 10 to the power 46 ergs per second. And such giant flares are very exotic events until now. Only three such giant flares have been observed till date. Uh, the next cases are the most uh, frequent flares that are typically observed in the case of magnetars. These are the short bursts. They last for durations of fractions of seconds to maximum a couple of seconds. They are usually very highly repetitive, particularly when the magnetar is in a very active state, and they are observed in the soft gamma ray ranges. And the total isotropic energy that is released in such short flares uh, um, are below 10 to the 41 ergs. Such bursts are often observed to exhibit thermal spectra, but there have been cases where non-thermal emission has also been detected. So their origin is still and the corresponding radiative mechanism is still quite a bit of an unexplained phenomenon. And finally, we have the intermediate burst, which is in between these two extreme kind of bursts. And this particular burst have isotropic energies in the ranges of 10 to the power 41 to 10 to the power 43 ergs. Here you can see such an example of an intermediate burst which we had worked on. And this particular burst again are usually characterized by a very very hard spike. The typical duration over which they last are few seconds again, but in these cases what is often seen is the fact that these bursts are often followed by a long lasting slowly decaying till, what we call the extended till phase. And during this period, the flux has not come back to the previous level, and often during these phases, uh, another series of subsequent bursts are observed, which what you can see in this particular plot, this 3-year subsequent burst happening in the extended tail. And such tail can last from few tens of seconds to thousands of seconds. And one can get an idea that a lot of the energy released in, let's say, a crustal fracture scenario or even a reconnection scenario may be channeled in the extended emission phase, which can comprise of a lot of the energy budget. So, with that in mind, let's look a little bit into what these extended tails are. So, the idea is that in, in the case of an intermediate burst during the flare, a fireball has formed from the processes that I have described before, and this fireball uh, is giving rise to the burst flare or the main flux that is given away during the burst. But let's assume this fireball is relatively inefficiently radiating. In that case, what would happen is that it would be a fraction of the energy will be kind of trapped inside the fireball, and the particles that are inside it will kind of return back to the stellar surface, thereby heating it up. And this particular inefficient fireball is basically the one that is giving rise to the extended tail. And as the particle heats back the stellar surface, it creates they create a hot spot, and this hot spot kind of cools over the entire length of the extended tail phase, which is observed through the temperature decay during such tails. So, with that in mind, let's look at the first case of magnetoflares. So, here we are looking at two distinct flares from a particular very bright classic magnetic source. This is an anomalous X-ray pulsar source 4U0142+61. This is one of the brightest one, and here we are looking at two distinct flares shown here, event A and event B. Event A lasts for um, a few seconds during the flare, followed by an extended phase of few 400 seconds about. And for event B, the main peak happened for a few seconds, followed by a extended tail phase, which lasted for a duration of about 1500 seconds. So we looked at the corresponding spectral evolution during these two cases, and interestingly enough, firstly, what we observe is that for the case of event A, the burst spectra itself was well described by a thermal emission, which here you can see the corresponding temperature of the thermal emission. But in the case of event B, the burst emission not shown here was needed a non-thermal model. So it basically tells you the radiative processes, at least to the most best resolution possible, varied between these two bursts themselves, even from the same source. Secondly, during the tail phase, we also looked at how the spectra evolved during that phase. And during the tail phase, it was observed that the spectra can be well described by a simple cooling thermal hotspot. So one can look at the corresponding evolving temperature during this tail phase in the second panel, which shows a constant, a coherent cooling decay, systematic cooling decay. And there was a secondary burst happening for this case, which resulted in a slightly increased temperature during this case. In the case of event B also, one could see very clear cooling trend, and the corresponding radius and the flux of the hotspot are also shown here in the next two panels. The two important points to take here is first, the burst spectra showed both thermal and non-thermal emission, and secondly, we can see a very coherent cooling decay during the extended tail phase. Apart from that, another interesting thing that was observed during the extended tail is that for the spectra, which was more or less well described by a thermal, let's say, Planckian spectrum, but in the higher energies, harder X-rays, like around 10 keV and above, we could detect very strong hard X-rays. And this is a very important characteristic of magnetar emission. And the reason of hard X-rays is still a very heated and debated question, often related to the magnetic field and the alpha and wave interactions. But let's not go into that. But just to uh, give the interesting result that during this extended emission phase, one could very clearly detect the hard excess, which is often not that well observed in the cases of normal persistent magnetar emission. This is an example of some of those spectra during the extended tail phase. This is for event B. And in this way, we are going, starting from the burst, going ahead in time. And one can see the various spectra that are happening as the time evolves during the burst. One interesting thing that can be observed in one of the spectrum just following the burst is the presence of these strong absorption lines. These dips that you see here corresponds to the absorption lines at energies 4.5, 6.5, and there was one at 10.5 kV here. So here. So, uh, and these absorption lines were present just following the burst, and as the temperature and the flux decayed, they slowly disappeared, and they were not observed anymore. Uh, these lines were previously also observed from this source for a different set of flares. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, sorry, my head. Yeah, sorry. Huh. So, uh, so what gave rise to the spectral lines? So, given the energy of these lines, the only most prominent process that can give rise to such strong absorption lines is a process of proton cyclotron resonance phenomenon in this ultra strong magnetic field. We have a rough idea of the magnetic field of this particular magnetar. So, given that uh, the absorption line roughly corresponds to the proton cyclotron resonance phenomenon, the idea is that the photons that are coming from the fireball are interacting with the magnetosphere, and as they're interacting with the magnetosphere, they are giving rise to these absorption lines. And these are transient because the efficiency of this cyclone resonance phenomenon is high when the temperature and flux are high enough. And as they decay, this process becomes inefficient, resulting in the disappearance of the line and the transient nature of the line. The geometric effects also might have some impact on the presence and absence of such lines. And from the lines that we have detected at 4, 6.5 and around 11 keV, one could roughly predict the possible magnetic field that you would expect, assuming a cyclotron resonance phenomenon. And the corresponding magnetic field values come to the 1.1 into 10 to the 15, 1.9 into 10 to the 15, and 3.1 into 10 to the 15 Gauss respectively. This is a little higher than the inferred dipolar field strength of this particular magnetar, which was 10 to the, about 10 to the 14 Gauss. And this is possibly due to the due to the fact that these lines are possibly getting generated by significant multipolar magnetic field effects, and not just the assumption of dipolar magnetic field can work here. And that is even more enhanced by the fact that we see complex structures in the pulse profile itself of this magnetar. I will quickly proceed here. So the next thing that we looked into this particular two events is its timing behavior. And as you see these two events, here in the next panels, what we see is the strength of the pulse amplitude, uh, strength of the pulsation uh, in different energy ranges. And one can clearly see that just after the flare has happened, the strength of the pulsation itself has increased compared to the pre-burst level. It is also very clearly seen in the case of event B that the strength of pulsation gets increased. It remains high during the extended tail phase and slowly over time decaying to the pre-burst values. So, just to conclude this part, uh, the total energy that was uh, emitted during the burst and the tail phases corresponds to these values. And one could see that for event A and event B, it showed a variation. So the total energy budget that will go into each of these channels, the burst and the tail itself, varies from case to case. That can explain why such intermediate were show a wide range of variation in their properties. The inefficient radiation basically is resulting in a residual energy reservoir, and that is powering the extended tail phase over a prolonged period of time. And in this inefficient reservoir, the inefficient radiating fireball that we are talking about, energy is getting deposited back to the surface by this particles hitting back, and that can also explain the enhanced pulse amplitude, particularly if the trapped fireball is formed close near the magnetic poles. Huh. And that is exactly concurrent with whatever we observe in the case of increased pulse amplitude in the longer, particularly in the case of longer duration tails. So that gives a good idea about what happens during the extended tail phase. Now, here I would like to slightly change track and move on to a different case. Uh, so, in this case, we start with something different. We start with, instead of magnetars, we start with short GRBs. We know GRBs are gamma ray burst, and in this case, we are talking about a particular GRB. This was a short gamma ray burst. By short, I mean it lasted for few fractions of seconds. Huh. And such short gamma ray bursts, their origin is still a debated phenomenon, and they are particularly attributed to mergers or explosions from compact stars like the giant flares from magnetars. There have been a couple of candidate short GRBs which are thought to be giant flares instead of the canonical short GRBs that we know of. So recently, such a short GRB was detected in April 2020, and here you can see the light curve of the short GRB using Fermi GBM and HXMT in different energy bands, and it was also detected by several other telescopes. One interesting thing of this short GRB was this could be quite closely associated with a galaxy, the Sculptor galaxy, which is at a distance of 3.5 megaparsec, and one could, with quite good confidence, associate this GRB to this particular galaxy with a chance probability of 1.3 into 10 to the minus 5. So, given that it is associated with such a galaxy and its properties showed a slight variation from the traditional short GRBs, uh, we kind of argued for the giant flare origin of this particular GRB. And with that, we looked into the Fermi GBM data of this particular short GRB to understand its spectral evolution. In short, this is the this is the summary of the properties of this particular short GRB. It showed a typical rise time of 2 milliseconds and a decay time of 8 milliseconds, roughly total corresponding to about um, uh, a duration of around 10 milliseconds with the extended emission phase following the sharp peak. Here you can see the sharp peak, and following that there is extended phase, which correspond to about 200 milliseconds. The peak flux was about 10 to the power minus 3 arcs per centimeter square per second, which was quite bright, and the total isotropic energy that was calculated to be emitted during this particular event was 10 to the power 46 arcs. So this made it a very interesting event to study. So one of the first things to do is to compare it with the standard short GRBs. So this plot shows the minimum timescale of variability during the GRB and its duration, or T90 duration. T90 duration is the time it takes to fall to 90% of its peak flux. So here the square shows the short GRBs and the circles shows the long GRBs. And this particular event was was to the very end of the limit of the short GRBs. And in the case of the spectral hardness of this particular event with respect to the duration, as compared to the other classes of GRBs, the blues one shows the short GRBs and the red one shows the long GRBs. Here also, it was a slightly aloof, was an outlier in this class, and here the star that you can see represents this event, or represent the spike of this event, and the square represent the softer tail of this event. With that, let's look at the corresponding radiative behavior of this particular short GRP event. So to understand the radiative behavior, we performed a time resolved spectroscopic analysis by dividing the short GRB into this 13 segments shown here by these red lines, red dashed lines, segmented based on the corresponding intensity. And in each segment, spectral analysis was done. We tried several models representing a combination of thermal, non-thermal emission and their combination. For most intents and purposes, the cutoff power law and a multicolored black body more or less both fared similarly and quite well to explain most of this spectra. These are right now mostly phenomenological, but one can relate to the various radiative processes, synchrotron and other, that is happening. So here you can see such a spectrum of one of the events using the cutoff power law. And and this particular plot shows the time resolved spectroscopic results, the evolution of the parameters as a function of the time during the short GRB for the three different models: the cutoff power law, the single black body, and the multicolored black body, where the black body temperature varied by a power law with the index of m. So one can see here that during this particular flare shown here by the light blue line, the peak energy during the flare was very high, and then it showed a slow decay during the during the tail phase, cooling phase, during the tail phase, showing a softening of the spectrum. For the photon index, it was more or less consistent with the flat spectrum during the peak, but showed a little bit of variation during the extended tail phases. For the single black body, it was not a very good fit. Let's remember that. Keeping that in mind, it showed a very nice cooling kind of a pattern during the tail phase. And for the multicolored black body phase, also for the minimum temperature and the maximum temperature, one could see a very quick, rapid spectral evolution. First of all, distinct spectral evolution between the burst and the tail, and secondly, just following the burst, a rapid spectral evolution. So let's then compare the statistical properties of this short GRB event with the particular classes of short and long GRBs. And here you can see the relationships between the peak energy and the isotropic total energy that you would see for the cases of short and long GRBs, and they tend to follow very strong correlation in this particular phase space. In this phase space, this red point shows the this particular event, and one can see that this deviates very strongly from the in either of the cases, particularly the short GRB population. The other points in color basically represent the other candidate giant flare short GRBs, and one can see that they form a separate clustering population in this particular phase space. Also, in
Nonita,
terms, yeah,
sorry, please try to wrap up in 2 minutes.
yeah, okay, I'm almost done. So the, one can look at the number distribution of the different parameters like the duration, the total fluence, the photon index, and the peak energy. The black line here shows the general short GRB population, and the red line and the other colored line shows the this particular event and other candidate giant flare short GRB events respectively. And one can see that this particular class of short GRBs populate a certain region of this distribution, sorry, certain region of this plot, and particularly in terms of fluence, they are quite significantly different from the short GRP population. So just to conclude, is 2004-15A is a giant flare or a canonical short GRP? The answer is probably most likely yes, because of the reason that we just described. It shows a similar energy to the giant flares. It shows an association with the with a particular galaxy, It shows a quasi-thermal spectrum which rapidly evolves following the flaring event. And as I discussed, the statistical properties uh, are significantly different from the short GRB population that we know of, and that it it matches with the other giant flare short GRB candidates. So just to give the implications of this, this is the first this is the first giant flare, assuming it's a giant flare, given the argument that we had put forward, that was observed in the GeV energy range. Uh, so using the energetics, one can calculate the corresponding possible magnetic field of the parent star, which in this case we calculated to be 10 to the power 15 Gauss. The indistinguishableness of the other spectral properties of the giant flare short GRBs candidates, let's call it at this point, uh, with respect to the whole short GRB sample, may indicate that some of those ultra short GRBs are possibly giant flares, but at extragalactic distances, and this can be possibly indicated through their ultra short durations. Those ultra short duration short GLBs are possibly more likely to be giant flares, but this is not definitive at this point, and more follow-up observations and further investigations of such short GLBs are essential to understand their origin and firmly establish this connection. And with that, I put the summary slide that these flares are magnetic flares are very important and exotic phenomenon whose origin is still not completely understood, and they vary widely in properties, energetics, and recurrences, and they can be very strong signatures of the ultra strong magnetic field in neutron stars, and can be used to explain various transient events like short GRVs, and we have learned of fast radio bursts in the other lectures. So with that, a detailed study of flares and such their properties can lead to good understanding of their energetics and be crucial in addressing this long existing questions. With that, I end. And any questions, I will welcome them. Thank you. Sorry for running a little long.
It's okay. Thank you, Manonita. We can have some questions. Please raise your hand. Okay. So Shantanu, please go ahead.
Yeah, so very nice talk. So I was actually intrigued by your the GRP, which is an outlier, the short GRP, which is an outlier. So I guess a couple of questions. So since maybe I forgot, but is does this outlier also have a very short duration, less than 0.1 second?
Yes.
Okay, so just follow up comment. I mean, David Klein from UCLA did a lot of work on short GRB, on these very short GRBs with T90 less than 0.1 second, mainly from Batsy data, because Swift and Fermi don't have don't have large amount of such very ultra short GRBs, and he argued that these are galactic and from primordial black hole evaporation because they also follow a characteristic, I guess, spectrum. So I guess is this GRB consistent with those findings? I don't know this redshift, so if it is cosmological, then automatically rules it out. But just some of the other characteristics.
I don't remember exactly what characteristics was discussed in the paper, but definitely we did a detailed kind of statistical comparison with the standard short GRP population. And I showed a few glimpses of that, as you can see from, let's say, this. The distance was 3.5 kiloparsec, so, sorry, megaparsec. Sorry, megaparsec. So it's not very high redshift, but still good enough. Sorry, I am not able to completely answer your question. I don't know exactly what was discussed in those papers, but definitely we did a strong comparison with the general properties of the short GRPs, and both in theoretical and statistical terms.
Okay, I do not see any hands up and nothing in the chat box. So I suggest that please put your questions in the Slack channel so that Manonita can answer it at a later point, and maybe we can move over to the next talk. Thank you, Manonita. So please unshare. Okay, thank you. So the next talk is by Shyam Sundar from NCRA TIFR. He will be talking on wideband timing of millisecond pulsars with GMRT. Over to you, Shamsundar.
So you can hear me, right?
Yes.
So, okay, I'll be discussing the newly implemented wideband timing on the GMRT data, upgraded GMRT data. So, okay, let's start. So the pulsar broadband emission can be seen from radio to optical to gamma rays. And normally the pulsar rotation axis is not aligned with the radio beam. So whenever this radio beam cuts our line of sight, we see a pulsed emission. Out of this pulsar class, there is a class which are very stable, which are millisecond pulsar. As their name suggests, they have periods of order of milliseconds. They have very extreme clockwise behavior. So using their stability, they can be used as a probe of interstellar medium between Earth and pulsar in the line of sight. And the pulsar timing array community conducts experiments which try to find the low frequency gravitational waves using an array of millisecond pulsars spread all over the sky. So now say this is a neutron star. Its rotation axis is not aligned with the radio beam. Whenever this radio beam cuts our line of sight, telescope receives a pulse. Because different frequencies, due to ionized interstellar medium, different frequencies arrive at different times. So we de-disperse the data so that all pulses should arrive at the same time. We fold the pulsar data to get a stable mean profile. Then we measure the time of arrival, TOA, of the pulse with respect to a reference clock at the observatory. And any new timing noise, such as low frequency gravitational waves, detection of that noise will depends on the quality of TOAs. The quality of means accuracy and the precision of TOAs we measure. So this slides explains the basic timing analysis. First thing to do timing is to create a profile template of the pulsar, which should resemble the true integrated pulsar profile. So to create it, we add high signal to noise ratio profiles over several epochs. Then we fit Gaussians to it to get noise free template. After that, then observation comes. We fold the observation to get a stable profile. Then we cross correlate, we match this template to the folded profile to get the phase offset between these two. And this phase offset corresponds to the time of arrival of the pulse. I will explain this figure in the next slide. So in this talk, I will explain the two techniques. One is the standard techniques which is used over decades, the narrowband analysis, which don't use the fact that pulsar, which don't include that profile of the pulsar changes with frequency. But as the telescope advancement, as the telescopes are upgraded for the higher bandwidth, there is need to take account of profile evolution changes with frequency. So in the narrowband analysis, there is the profile evolution with frequency is not taken into account. But for the wideband timing, it does. I'll explain both the analysis and the comparison. So for the narrowband analysis, the first thing is again to create a template. So to create a template, we again add high signal to noise ratio profiles over several epochs. We scrunch the average profile in frequency as well as in time. Then we fit the Gaussians to the frequency time scrunch data to get an analytic template. Then this analytic template should look like this. This is just for illustration. And then observation comes, it is folded. And now we assume that the data set, the folded data set, should be the scaled and shifted version of the template. A is shift, phi is the A is scale, and phi is shift. So DK data is scaled by A, shift by phi version of the template. And we minimize this chi-square to get the phase offset between data and template. So once we find this phase shift, this corresponds to the time of arrival of the pulse. Due to interstellar medium, different, as I said, different frequency signals arrive at different times. So as can be seen here, y-axis shows frequency, and x-axis shows pulse phase, and higher frequency arrive at earlier time than the lower frequencies. So to quantify, there is a quantity which quantify this delay, which is dispersion measure, Coulomb density of electron in the line of sight. We fit mu square in this delays to get this quantity. We get this is residual versus MGD plot. We fit for individual channel, for individual epochs, we fit mu square into different frequency TOs for each epoch. We have DM for each epoch. So now the final output is one TOA corresponds to this phase offset, and one DM from the narrowband. One phase offset and one DM. Now the wideband analysis. Again, in the wideband analysis, we have data overall. We have data. We integrate several profiles over many epochs, but this time we are keeping the frequency resolution. We don't scrunch in frequency. Then we give this average profile as an input to principal component analysis. This principal component analysis find new basis eigenvectors which captures most of the profile evolution of the pulsar with frequency. So if I scrunch this average profile in frequency, this should look like the mean. This should look like this should be the mean profile, which should be similar to the narrowband template, and it is smooth here. It is shown here just for illustration. It should look like this. The principal component analysis results in set of eigenvectors, and this is illustration for one of the eigenvectors. There may require more than one eigenvector to model the profile evolution, but I have shown just one to just for illustration. Now, template at any frequency mu can be created by linear combination of mean profile plus set of eigenvectors, and the coefficient of the eigenvectors should trace a curve with frequency to capture the profile evolution of the pulsar. So this coefficient, so eigenvector again, this mean profile plus linear combination of eigenvectors shows the create the template, and this coefficient trace a curve with frequency. For illustration, I have shown this coordinate here, one of the coefficient here on y-axis, and frequency on x-axis. So this trace a smooth curve with frequency, and we can create template T mu at any frequency mu. The timing TOA measurement is almost same as the narrowband, but this time we are calculating phase offset on the individual channel basis. There is n here, means individual channel basis we are calculating phase offsets. Then in individual phase offsets, we are fitting one global offset phi naught and one dispersion measure by this equation. So now finally in the narrowband we have one timing time of arrival, one TOA, and one dispersion measure. In wideband timing also we have one TOA and one DM. Now we compare the results. So on the first column, it is pulsars, period, and its dispersion measure. These first two columns, second and third columns shows the median TOA uncertainty obtained from narrowband and wideband techniques. Then timing residuals from narrowband and wideband techniques in microseconds. Then DM uncertainty from narrowband and wideband techniques. The percentage improvement in DM uncertainty in the wideband technique. So if I read the first column for the pulsar J1646, this median TOA uncertainty improved from 4.2 to 2.8 in the wideband technique. Timing residual improved from 4.6 to 1.6 in the wideband technique. If I see the mean value, mean DM uncertainty, the mean uncertainty improved from 0.84 to 0.60. And we see a 29% improvement in this from in DM uncertainty from wideband to narrowband to wideband. And we see 55% improvement for J2144, 65% improvement for J1120. So finally, the model parameters obtained from the narrowband and wideband techniques should be similar to each other. Means should be closer to each other. This plot shows the model parameters differences for narrowband and wideband techniques. The zero line corresponds to the narrowband parameters. Say now the deviation of points from the deviation all points from the zero line shows the wideband parameters differences from the narrowband parameters. The deviation shows the differences from zero line, and the error bar shows the difference in uncertainty in the wideband technique divided by narrowband technique. So basically this one. And then finally, the first thing is with both the techniques, we are obtaining 10 to the power minus 4 order of DM accuracy with the UGMRT 200 megahertz bandwidth. And the residuals are order of microseconds. So on an average, for the 3 GMRT millisecond pulsars, we are obtaining DM accuracy of 50% averagely, and 1.6 times improvement in sigma TOA and timing residual with the wideband technique with respect to the conventional narrowband timing. And the model parameters are within plus minus 2 sigma for the pulsars, for the 3 pulsars. So that shows that it is reliable technique. And for the pulsar J1646, J1120, we see great improvement in model parameter precision also. So up to the results we are seeing improvement. But for the statistical result, we are including more data sets. We have submitted proposal for that in the cycle 40 also. So up to the results we are seeing, we can say that wideband is necessary for the high bandwidth at low frequency, for the high fractional bandwidth of the GMRT. And okay, I will. I think the time is 45, so I will stop on the future work slide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions? I do not see any hands. Chat, I don't see any either. So maybe I'll ask you a quick question. So I'm just curious because I'm not at all from the field that is GMRT unique in terms of this very wide bandwidth, or there are other facilities which have similar bandwidths and this technique has been implemented?
Yeah, for Nanograv, they have a larger bandwidth of 600 megahertz at 1.4 gigahertz, but they have not applied this wideband technique at the low frequency. And they have at low frequency they have a bandwidth of 20 megahertz, 20 to 40 megahertz. But with the UGMRT, we have a bandwidth of 200 megahertz. And in that range, the profile evolution very strongly changes for the pulsar. So it is nice to see the results of wideband technique at low frequency.
Thank you. So I think there are no further questions. So thank you, Shyam Sundar. We move on to the next talk, and that is by R.T. Gangadhara from Indian Institute of Astrophysics, and he will be talking on the coherent radio emission mechanism of pulsars. Over to you, Gangadhara. Yeah, could you please share your screen?
Can you see?
Yes, I
Can you
can.
see?
But yeah, I can see it, but try to make it full screen and see.
Yeah, right. Now, is it
Yeah.
okay?
Yes, and please try to change the screen. I guess change the slide. That probably should work as well. Yeah, fine. Please Please start.
Yeah. So good afternoon. So I've been working on coherent radio emission mechanism from pulsars. So with in collaboration with Professor Jinlin Han and P.F. Wang in NMOC. This is my recent work. So I thought I will present in ASI. So in my talk, I just got a brief introduction. Maybe in the previous talk already you heard some basics of pulsar geometry, all these things. So I will not spend much time on that. Viewing geometry of pulsar radio emission. Pulsar radio emission is highly beamed. So I've developed a model called tangent model. So with that, I could identify emission region in the pulsar magnetosphere. I just briefly touch on that. And then mechanism of pulsar radio emission is still an outstanding problem. So there are models based on incoherent radiation and coherent radiation. And then I have been working on coherent, this is coherent curvature radiation and incoherent curvature radiation. I will briefly go through them and then go to conclusion. So these are the pulses. So what you see is single pulses from some pulsars. That is, here is one pulsar, bright one. So what you turn plus 54, you see light curve. So you see these pulses. The pulses are very narrow. So if you find the time width, so this is a very fraction of a second, multiply by c speed of light, it will give you a rough idea about size of the emission region. That is very narrow. So in that narrow region, we get a strong emission that indicates that pulsar emission is highly high intense, that we say in terms of brightness temperature, very bright. So that cannot be explained by non-thermal radiation processes. So you should be coherent. So incoherent models emissions cannot explain that. So here you see another pulsar 1 in 50 plus G, right? Again, you see single pulses. So they are very narrow. And then from narrow region, a lot of radiation comes. So that cannot be explained by incoherent curvature radiation or incoherent emission mechanism, any, but only coherent radiation mechanisms can be used to explain them. But what is that model? Still, we don't know what is the mechanism. So I am proposing a model. I will come to that later. So already in the previous slide, you saw this picture. So pulsar neutron star and two emission beams are either side. They spin, and then we get the pulses as if the line of sight interacts this cone at different locations. So here what you see is the beaming region. So from aerodynamics, we know that if there is a particle or a charge which is relativistic and moves in a curved trajectory, it emits radiation of this 1 by gamma width. And then this is a beam radiation centered on the velocity. And if it is moving along the magnetic field line, this velocity is parallel to the tangent to the magnetic field line. And this is line of sight. The observer is that P observes this radiation. If N and V are parallel, then only observer can see radiation. Or if N and V fall within 1 by gamma, then also they can receive, the observer can receive radiation. If it is outside this, he cannot. So like that, even pulsar main beam also. So observer line of sight has to lie. So that is why this is a pulsar radiation highly beamed. So directional, the beaming geometry is very, very important here. Using that condition N dot B, that is N dot V, V is velocity parallel to magnetic field tangent. So that they should be parallel. So with this, I developed this tangent model. It is published in Stabilization 2004. For more details, you can look at that. So I derived two angles, magnetic colatitude, magnetic azimuth. So this is a colatitude angle between the position vector and the magnetic axis. And magnetic azimuth is the angle measured around the magnetic axis. So this will identify or give you the location of the field line tangent which aligns with the N. So N is the line of sight. When they are equal to 1, that means you receive radiation from that tangent. So, and then within that 1 by gamma around that. So these two angles are very accurate. So using this, we can identify geometry. So here I was just showing a spinning dipole here. So what you can see, so this is a spin, this is a dipole magnetic field line, spins around that. You can see this red arrow here. So that spins. As during spin, it changes the height. Oh, it's not changing. Somehow the animation is not working, so I will go to the next one. So here you can see this neutron star spins around the magnetic axis, around the spin axis, and this is magnetic axis, and there is the line of sight and magnetic field and tangent. And then in the classical model of Radhakrishnan Cook, line of sight is a fixed vector, but in this model I have shown, so it is not a fixed vector. Actually, it goes around through the circle. So you can see it spins like this. As Newton's first spins, line of sight goes through this type of circular arc around this trajectory. So we receive the radiation from all those field lines, which is traced by this B. So different field lines come into line of sight, and we receive radiation from that. So this motion can be observed in VLBI observation. This is reported by Penn et al. So this, and Ewan Melrose also estimated the errors introduced because of assuming magnetic field. Line of sight is a fixed vector, and line of sight is a vector which is changing parallelly. So what is the errors? So some estimates they have given here. Ewan and Melrose they have given. Okay, mechanism of radio emission. Pulsar radio emission is coherent and highly polarized. So this is known from classic papers by London, Manchester, Rankine, and then we have recently plenty of observations of many pulsars. So percentage of polarization varies from pulsar to pulsar, but pulsars normally the emission is always coherent. So what is the mechanism of coherent model? So emission. So many models have been proposed. Some of them partially successful. Some are still people are proposing, and then it is going on. So still it is an outstanding problem. Rotating magnetic field produces strong electric field which accelerates relativistic electrons from surface of neutron star. So these are called primary electrons. They emit gamma rays when they move along the strong magnetic field via synchrotron or curvature radiation, and then they are in the gamma rays. This synchrotron radiation emitted in gamma rays. So they undergo pair creation, produce electron-positron plasma. This is called a secondary pair plasma, which is the one responsible for radio wave emission. So what is the mechanism? So Ruderman Sutherland proposes oscillating two-stream instability, all these things. So and then people have been working on these things, and then he has proposed, Ruderman Sutherland have proposed many ideas in that model. So people are using that, refining those things. So radio emission models assume radiation is emitted by the relativistic plasma in the direction of magnetic field tangents. So this I have already used in my tangent model. And polarizing in the plane of dipolar magnetic field lines, that I will come to this in a minute. These are the basic things people models always use, and then go further with that. So emission mechanisms can be generally classified into two categories. One is coherent emission model, emissions, and incoherent emissions. And then the coherent is, so you see here the top, the wavy lines, they're all in phase. So coherent means the emission from different regions in the magnetosphere, that is called emission region. So emission comes in the in phase. That means you can add the electric fields in phase. So then after adding, you get the strong emission. But if it is incoherent, so the radiation from different regions need not be in phase. So then they out of phase. Then you get a weak emission. So this weak emission definitely cannot explain pulsar radio brightness. So only coherent emission. Then what is the mechanism of coherent radiation? I've been working on incoherent models. Now recently I started working on coherent. So I will just present my results in that. So the electric field of the radiation, we have charge Q, it moves along the any curved trajectory with velocity beta and beta dot acceleration. Then line of sight is a observed line of sight wherever you are sitting. So that is a line of sight with respect to source. Then if you know these three parameters, you can just plug in. R is the distance between the observer and the source. And then we can get the electric field of the radiation. So this radiation is mostly, this electric field of the radiation is polarized in the direction parallel to the acceleration, almost nearly parallel to that. And this has to be estimated at the retarded time because the pulsars are very far. So this time separation between observer and source is huge. So within that time, light takes a finite time. So this we cannot really identify the geometry. So there is a factor called zeta here. Xi. Xi is 1 minus beta dot n. So beta dot n I explained already. Beta and n, the beta is velocity and n should be parallel. If they are parallel, you can see zeta will go to its minimum. So that is 1 by zeta cube. So this cube of this will be a big number. So it multiplies this, and then you get a strong electric. That means you receive a stronger emission when beta and n are parallel. So that is the idea behind this tangent model. Okay, so the other parameters we have to identify from geometry. So that calculation is a tedious. So I've done those things. Maybe I'll not go to that. Radius to frequency mapping. This can be explained with curvature radiation. So this plasma moves along the field lines and diverges. So then these are the hot spots are the emissions. And then you can see if you go to higher altitude, their separation is more. The pulses are broad. And then from observation, we know low frequency pulses are broad, high frequency is narrow. So that is called radius to frequency mapping. So this is known from observation, and then curvature radiation supports that. So incoherent radiation, curvature radiation model can explain. So radius to frequency mapping. So low frequency pulses are broad. So and then high frequency are narrow. Anti-symmetric circumpolation, I didn't go to that. So circumpolation as so two senses, clockwise, counterclockwise. So that always we see one as pulsar rotates, mostly in the core region as well as in the component regions. But core region is very prominent. PA is consistent with rotative vector model. So this I successfully explained for the first time using the electric field of the radiation field. Earlier it was done with spherical trigonometry, but here in this model, I was very clearly explained that. Correlation with antisymmetric circumpolation PA swaying is this was observed by Radhakrishnan and Rankine, and then I showed that this is a geometric effect, and then again this result is presented in this paper. And then symmetric type also can be explained by using aberration retardation effects if you include that, and then this is also shown in these papers. And then what about brightness temperature? So normally brightness temperature pulse size varies from 10 to 25 to maybe 30, something like that, 33. So then how do you explain that? So incoherent, I've explained earlier, incoherent radiation models cannot explain that, only coherent will do. So I am considering coherent curvature radiation model to explain this brightness, high brightness temperature. So here is a profile, a single pulse containing a micro pulses. So these are sharp pulses. So what you see dotted is average, and this is single pulse. Now you see very strong emissions. So these are a very narrow pulse, narrow pulses. These are narrower than the sub pulses, and then they are very intense. So you see some of them are even stronger than the average pulse. So how does this radiation come from? So you can also estimate C times delta T. If you multiply, you get that it is about 100 meters or so. You get a very narrow region. So this high temperature, brightness temperature, how do we explain? So this is, yeah.
Excuse me, Gangadhara, could you please wrap up in 1 minute?
Yeah. Okay, so this is maybe I just explained this current curvature radiation model. So I just maybe I just move to results. So just consider a geometry like this. So this is going to appear soon. So I'll just maybe just so this is, we have to solve this electric field, and then okay, these are the emissions along the magnetic field lines. So and then okay, we have to solve Fourier integrals, volume integrals, and then okay, so you need to estimate the value of the plasma which is moving along magnetic field lines. So using this, we can estimate the emission region, and then simulations also we can do with this. Stokes parameters we identify, and then plasma parameters we have to put in, and then here is the result. So what you see is the intensity profile. So I versus intensity versus rotation phase. You can see intensity I linear circular. You can see the sense is changing like this. This is called antisymmetric circumpolation. When omega is equal to omega 0, omega 0 is plasma frequency, omega is radiation frequency. When they are matched, there is a resonant coupling happens between radiation and plasma. So plasma gives energy to the radiation, then you get an enhanced emission whenever there is a resonance. So here in another case, omega equal to 2 omega 0. So this is not resonant. So this radiation frequency double the plasma frequency. In that case, emission is weak. So you can see this is a very strong emission, weak emissions. Using this peak emissions of I in this plot. So that is about 9.1 10 to the minus 14 ergs per centimeter square per second per hertz. So that is the intensity, that is the flux. So S nu, and then putting into this formula 102 kb lambda square S nu C delta T by R. So if you substitute all this, then you get brightness temperature about 10 to 33. So very consistent with observations. So and in the other case, so you get 10 to 31. So if you go to very non-resonant, maybe omega is some 10 times, 20 times, then brightness temperature will significantly fall. So these are other cases. So this is different
Sorry, please
genetic benefits.
summarize. We are
Yeah,
out of time now. It's
yeah,
past
right.
15 minutes.
Okay, conclusion. We have developed a coherent curvature radiation model for radio pulsars. So the collective behavior among the radiating particles is crucial for coherent radio emission. The model explains the emission of coherent curvature radiation and its polarization state, confirms the correlation between polarization angle swaying and sense reversal is a geometric effect. Coherent curvature radiation is nearly 100% polarized in the case of monochromatic wave. Brightness temperature about 10 to the power 25 to 23 Kelvin predicted in by the model are closely aligned with the observations. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Quick questions. We could have 1 or 2 quick questions.
Yeah, right.
I do not see any hands. Okay, so I do not see any hands, and there are no questions on the chat as well.
Okay.
So, okay, I request you to post your question on the Slack channel so that Gangadhara can respond to it later.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
thank you, Gangadhara. We'll move on to
Yeah.
the next talk. Please unshare your screen.
Yeah, right.
So the next talk is by Ashwin Devaraj of Raman Research Institute. He is going to talk on the NuSTAR view of the cyclotron line source XTE J1946 plus 274. Gangadhara, please stop sharing. Okay,
Hello.
thank you. Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please share your screen.
Just 1 second. So, my slide visible?
Yes. Yes. And the slide transition box, fine. So start, please.
Okay. Okay. Please let me know at about 10 minutes, I guess.
Yeah. So 12 minutes. So I'll tell you after 10 minutes. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. So hi, I'm Ashwin Devraj. I'm a JAP student. I'm from Indian Institute of Science and Raman Research Institute. My supervisor is Professor Bishwet Paul, and this is the NuSTAR. I'm showing the results of the NuSTAR analysis of this source, X-ray binary XEJ1946 plus 274. So the results I'll be discussing are mainly in 2 parts. One is the spectral and timings analysis of the source, and the investigation of the luminosity dependence of the cyclotron line of the source. So this is a B X-ray binary, which means that the compact object is a neutron star and the companion is a main sequence a B-type star, and it's a rapid rotating B-type star. So there's a circumstellar disk around the B-type star, and whenever the neutron star passes by during the periastron passage, there is an outburst, and that's how we figure out the orbital period. And sometimes when the mass ejection happens, large mass ejection happens, you have type 2 outbursts, which result in extremely high luminosities. And this source is found to have an orbital period of 172 days, and it has a spin period of 15.76 seconds. And the distance to the source was estimated to be about 8.7 plus minus 1.2 kiloparsec. The error on the distance estimate is quite large, but that will have implications later. This source was found to exhibit cyclotron line at 37 keV. This implies a magnetic field of about 3.1 into 10 power 12 Gauss. In the last two decades, it was observed 3 times and during 3 outbursts, one in 98, 2010, and 2018. So I'll be reporting on the studies of the 2018 outburst. So in 2018, June 24th, the source was observed for about for a day's time, and the exposure time was about 47 kiloseconds. So during this phase of the outburst, you can see the yellow dot. That is the point when we had the NuSTAR observation. Using epoch folding techniques, we found that the spin period to be about 15.755 seconds. And we found that there's also a period derivative term, which is minus 4.15 into 10 power minus 10 seconds per second. We also find that the pulse profiles are energy dependent, and the source was observed at a flux of 2.6 into 10 power minus 9 ergs per centimeter square per second, implying a luminosity of 2.4 into 10 power 37 ergs per second. So these are the pulse profiles, and as we can see, they are double peak structure. And these are the energy resolved pulse profiles in 3 to 12, 12 to 22, and so on. And you can see that the second peak is reducing in its intensity as the energy range that we're considering goes higher, and it totally disappears in the range of 32 to 42 keV. So this could be due to the cyclotron absorption, which is what we think, because the cyclotron line is seen at 37 keV, and above 52 keV, the pulsations are hardly detectable. So this is we can clearly see that the pulse profiles are energy dependent. So accretion onto a neutron star basically is that when you have material falling in to the neutron star, you the formation of an accretion disk, and then the magnetic field lines guide the plasma onto the magnetic poles, and where an accretion column is formed, a shock is produced there, and from around the accretion column, the X-rays are produced. If the magnetic axis and the rotation axis are misaligned, we start seeing pulsations, and if the misalignment is quite large, the angle between the magnetic and rotation axis is quite large, then we are probably even able to see the pulse twice within one rotation. And that could be one explanation for the double peak structure. But of course, as we'll see later, the geometry of the accretion will also play a role in determining that. So the spectral modeling of the source, NuSTAR operates in 379 keV range, and the background, the SNR drops below the drops to a low value above 55 keV. As we can see, the pulsations were not very prominent. So we can see that this particular spectra was modeled using TB-APS for a low energy part, and the ion line at 6.5 keV, broad ion line, and a power law with a cutoff at about 20 keV, and then a cyclotron absorption line included will model it perfectly. In this case, the strength of the cyclotron line has been set to 0 for the yellow line to show that there's a presence. The same model, but just the strength is set to 0, just for representation purpose. So this is the final model that we used to model the spectra. So here you have 6 panels. The first of these are showing the best fit model using the high energy cutoff model. The high energy cut model is just a power law multiplied by an exponential cutoff, and the NPEX model is a combination of two power laws, two cutoff power laws, and complete is a more physical model. So in the first panel over here, we can see that the cyclotron line, including the cyclotron line, the best fit, the residues are pretty clean. And then if I were to set the strength of the cyclotron line, the gaps to 0, I can see the cyclotron line feature. If I were to remove the gaps entirely, you can see that there are additional residues here, which tell us that we do need a additional gaps component. So we proceeded to do phase resolved spectroscopy of the source and extracted the spectra in 20 phase bins. And this is the pulse profile. And what we see here, the gray points are indicative of the count rates as well as the size of the phase bin, each phase bin. And we use the model of TB-APS, power law, cutoff, power law multiplied by cutoff plus a Gaussian as the base model for all these things and all these spectra. And we've included GABs, the 10 keV and the cyclotron line GABs whenever they were needed. The 10 keV feature is not very well understood, but it has been reported by Cowan et al. That has been seen in several X-ray binary sources, and it has been observed even in the phase average spectra. So proceeding further, this is the result of the phase resolved analysis. We find that the power law index dips at both the peaks, which is indicative of, if the emission is coming from the accretion the poles on neutron star, we expect the spectra to be hardest there, and the ECUT model is slightly anti-correlated with the gamma. That's indicative of the fact that the harder the spectra, the faster it drops. So the more interesting part that I would like to bring your attention to is the presence of the cyclotron line. The cyclotron line is not detected at all the phases. It's detected only in a narrow range of phases between 0.55 and 0.9. So this is not due to a low count rate, but rather the fact that we did not need a gaps component to explain. And this was also observed previously by Doroshenko using BeppoSAX data of the 98 outburst. And we find that the cyclotron line energy is nearly constant with the phase. And then the depth, of course, seems to vary. So to show the dependence of the cyclotron line on the depth, I show this ratio plot, which is a ratio of the data in the uh, qth phase, this data from this phase, the ratio of that to the model from the eth phase. So the best fit model did not require a cyclotron line. It was just fit by the cutoff power law model. And then that is actually why we can see there's a strong phase dependence of the cyclotron line. So moving on, showing you the dependence of the cyclotron line energy on time. There does not appear to be a very strong variation, but in order to probe further, we need to remove the luminosity dependence of the source. We need to observe the source of the same luminosity to make a claim. So next, we compile the data from all the previous published results, and we fit a straight line through it to between the function of ESAC as a function of flux, and we find that firstly that the correlation is not very strong, as a slope is about minus 0.3 with about 50% error. So nothing to write home about. But nonetheless, what needs to be appreciated is the fact that the source was observed at a huge range of fluxes, and this has implications later. So the correlation between the cyclotron line energy and the luminosity, what does it tell us? What's so special about it? So the fact is that depending on whether there's a correlation or no correlation, or Becker et al. Put across a theory saying that if there's a shock that's formed at the surface, above the neutron star near the accretion column, the cyclotron line forming region is there. So the closer the cyclotron line forming region is to the neutron star, the higher the magnetic field it will measure. As you move further away from the surface of the neutron star, you'll measure a lower magnetic field. So depending on the accretion rate, initially you will have no correlation in the lower luminosity case. As you continue to increase the accretion rate, you will start a Coulombic shock will form, which will create a shock forming region at a certain height above the neutron star. And when the accretion rate continues to further increase, the cyclotron line forming region will be pushed towards the surface of the neutron star. However, if the radiation pressure starts to dominate at some point, the cyclotron line forming region will be pushed away from the surface, resulting in a negative correlation. So you will measure a lower value of the cyclotron line energy for a higher luminosity. Okay. So the point at which this transition happens is supposed to be the critical luminosity, and it is of great interest for us to know when this radiation regime change happens. So typically, using the formula presented in Becker et al., for typical parameters and given the range of cyclotron line energy that are commonly observed, you find the critical luminosity to be typically of the order of 2 to 3 into 10 power 37 ergs per second. So
you are almost at the 11 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So now about the critical luminosity, it also happens that when the matter falls onto the neutron star and starts streaming along the field lines, so when the optical depth is low, the X-ray that's produced escapes along the field lines. When the accretion rate increases, the optical depth of the accretion column increases, and the photons also start escaping from the walls of the accretion column. So this is also a reason why, if you see a double peak structure, even if the angle between the neutron star and the magnetic axis is shallow, you find that even you expect to see the pulse only once every 2 pi. But because of the fan beam accretion, you start seeing subpulses, and you can't really determine what the angle between the magnetic rotation axis is accurately. The modeling becomes much more complicated. So where does 1946 fit in the big grand scheme of things? What's so special about seeing it in such a large range? So far, several sources have shown a positive correlation, implying that they were in the Coulombic shock regime. And only one source has confirmed observation of having seen a negative correlation, that is V0332 plus phi 3. And it has also shown a positive correlation at a lower luminosity, a negative correlation at higher luminosity. And A0535 plus 26 shows a positive correlation at higher luminosity with no correlation at low. So all these sources show complex variations over when observed at a large luminosity range. And of course, the data that's available for 1946 is quite sparse, and future observations will help put constraints. And of course, the problem is that it is a transient, and we need to wait for when it shows up. So I'll just summarize. So 1946 is a B X-ray binary, and it underwent a major outburst in 2018 June. The source was found to be spinning up due to an accretion torque, and the cyclotron line was reconfirmed at 37.8 keV with a magnetic field, implying a magnetic field strength of 3.26 to 10 power 12 Gauss near the surface of the neutron star. And the pulse profiles are clearly energy dependent, and this prompted us to do phase resolved analysis. And one of the most interesting results are that the cyclotron line is not seen in all the phases of this of the phase resolved spectroscopy. And of course, the source was observed over a huge range of fluxes, implying that the critical luminosity could lie in the luminosity range that we see, and that's probably why we do not get a straightforward linear correlation. And of course, the issue is that the luminosity has a 13% error, which means, sorry, the distance has 13% error, implying that the luminosity would have a 26% error. The entire range will shift to the left or to the right by about 26%. Of course, better distance estimate will allow us to fix the luminosity range. And of course, future polarimetric missions will help us figure out what component of the emission was fan beam or pencil beam or transition accretion regimes. So thank you.
Thank you, Ashwin. Questions for you? Yeah. Let me just check. So there's one question on the chat from Jitesh. The cyclotron line is not very strong in NuStar FPMB. If I am right, what is the reason for that?
I'm sorry. Which FPMB? Okay, is this a slide? I hope. Here the white corresponds to FPM A, while the blue corresponds to FPM B. The cyclotron line is visible, seen in both. Does this answer the question?
I think, I do not see any response from the person who has asked.
FPM A and FPM B are identical detectors, and I think the next slide.
No, he says next slide. Yeah.
Okay. This is the slide. The next slide is the phase resolved spectra. This is a count rate.
Hi, Ashwin. Can you hear me?
I can hear. Please.
Yeah. So there is one slide where you shown like a single full figure of the cyclotron line, I guess. Maybe the.
So this is one slide where I've shown the entire spectra, unfolded spectra, and here actually it's because of the color scheme that the white is not very clearly visible. So
what I've seen is like the red point is like you can clearly see is going up, but the white one is not going up. I mean, like it is like well below the line. Maybe you zoomed it and showed it, I guess. Like
you're showing
not this one.
Okay.
So you're showing a residual plot somewhere. Yes.
Just saying this one, residual plots.
Not this one. So there is one more slide. Maybe I missed it, I guess. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, I think I'll.
I think you can discuss it on on Slack. Any further questions? I do not see any raised hand.
I think there's one more question in the.
Yeah, Manonita had asked. So Manonita, I think you can ask. What is the possible physical reason behind the line being present at only specific phases?
Okay, so one of the things that I'd like to point here in the phase resolved spectra are that for a few observations are that the first peak, the primary peak, is harder than the secondary peak, and I think Putanen suggested a theory that the radiation from the accretion column gets reflected off the atmosphere of the neutron star, and then the cyclotron line forming region is there. So if that is the case, then of course it's natural to assume that the reflected radiation would be softer, and that the cyclotron line being formed there would be in the softer peak. Of course,